I mean, I married, I was past 30. I think I was actually 34 years old when I married. But before that time, I was dating quite a bit and was jumping jobs. I was jumping around to different girlfriends as well. And
Yeah.
again, I can tell you right now, it was to try to fill that hole that romance or sexual pursuits was not going to fill. And I think when you get to spirituality, if you try to fill that hole with spirituality, you say, aha, that's what was missing.
Good to see you back here on the Pulse. I'm Patricia Falco Beccalli, your host. Well, and today I'm very excited. We are going to have Tom Rapsas on the show. He's the author of this book called Wake Up Call. It's the daily insights for the spiritually curious. So perhaps this is going to ring a bell with you. I thought that Tom's book was very interesting, and also his transition from what he calls himself, he used to be an ordinary guy, to his current position as an enlightened spiritual blogger, writer, and guide and teacher as well. So I really look forward to the conversation. We're going to talk about how to find your purpose in life, how to actually find perhaps the voice inside that guides you rather than all the noise outside of you. There's many issues we're going to go through. This book is a exactly 16-week reads, because there's a manual to how to read this book and really take the most out of his lessons. So I'm really excited to have Tom Rapsas there. I hope you enjoy all of my conversations here on the Pulse. If you do, give us a thumbs up. Give us a like, give us some love, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel, to my channel, to our conversations, and hopefully your inspirations. I see you in a minute with Tom Rapsas. Go out there together. We begin to share. Again, good to have you back here on the Pulse. I'm Patricia Falco Beccalli. I promised you Tom Rapsas. Here he is. Tom, thank you so much for joining on the Pulse.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, Tom, you are a spiritual blogger, a spiritual writer. Your latest book, which I enjoyed so much, Wake Up Call, Daily Insights for the Spiritually Curious. Now, when I read about you, what I thought was interesting, you described yourself as an ordinary guy. What is an ordinary guy?
Well, I've read a lot of spirituality books, and frequently the authors are, I mean, they might be a theologian, they might be a monk, they might come from the world of philosophy or psychiatry or research. I'm part of the business world. I mean, I've worked in advertising for 40 years. I'm kind of a 9 to 5 guy. So I kind of work the spirituality into my daily business life. So that's where I guess the regular guy part falls in. That for me, it wasn't something that was my total focus. I was really, working in the business world and still am, but it became something that I realized that could really help support me both at work and, of course, outside of work as well.
No, absolutely regular guy. I said ordinary guy, and there is everything but ordinary stuff about you, that's for sure. A regular guy. So I think it's an interesting one to just look at the concept of looking back at what one had as one everyday life, the regular life, the regular guy, and then finding what you're doing right now, being into spirituality and getting to it. And your book, Wake Up Call, my question is, you must have had a wake-up call somewhere along the line, doing your 9 to 5 job, in advertising in New York. I mean, this is a pressure cooker.
It is, and quite honestly, it didn't happen right away. I was probably about 10 years into my career, maybe 12 years into my career, at which point I had switched jobs a lot. I had worked at, I believe it was like eight different jobs in the first 10 years, and I kept jumping ship. Now, I was changing jobs to get more money or maybe a promotion in a lot of cases, but I wasn't really finding any happiness. And I kind of thought, well, if I get this next job, then I'll be happy. Oh, well, this isn't it. Maybe this other job will make me happy. And it just wasn't working out. And that's when I kind of had a heart to myself to say, hey, it's not the career you should be focusing on. It's really, my true self, my inner self. And about that point, and again, I'm 10 years into my career, a friend of mine gives me a spirituality book. And it wasn't really all that spiritual. It was about a guy who taught sensitivity training to Green Berets. But there was some spiritual element in that book. And that really just got the ball rolling. I saw that this spiritual direction actually helped these hardcore Green Beret guys become more sensitive and aware. And I thought, well, maybe there's something there. And that just steamrolled from one book to another, one podcast to another. I just had this insatiable appetite to read about spiritual, religious, and philosophy topics, which I did. And as time went on, I found some philosophies and principles that began to help me. And they kind of made my job a little easier and really took some of the stress out of my life. And as we all know, when you have stress in your job, it can kind of transfer to your personal life as well. And that was sort of the key. As I began to have a better relationship with work and was better able to cope with work, it also improved my life outside of work. The two became connected.
What strikes me in what you were saying, the sensitivity, awareness, and your job hopping, looking outside of yourself for that satisfaction, that fulfillment. And by reading this book, that sensitivity is already something to do with your senses, with looking and feeling, being aware of what's going on inside. Was that the pivot where you thought, oh my God, I'm looking actually into the wrong direction?
Well, that's a great point. And sometimes these messages that you have to be hit over the head with them. But from book to book, I was always coming across this idea that true happiness, true satisfaction, contentment is found within. You're not going to find it outside yourself. And I think in our society, that's just something we do naturally. We look outside ourselves for happiness. And it's not just career and job hopping. It can be a romantic relationship. You jump from relationship to relationship. It can be the pursuit of material goods. We always think if we get, a better relationship, a better car, a bigger house, it will somehow make us happy. And then you begin to find that that's not really the answer. And again, I read in book after book, well, if you really want to find true happiness, you've got to find it within yourself. Um, One of my favorite books, I just reread it recently, is The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. And that's a story of a guy that is pursuing his dreams and he travels around the world and he winds up at the end of the story back home. And he finds that the real treasure in life is, in his case, it's literally in his backyard under a tree. But all this searching, it can be good. You develop, you become a little more worldly. You become wiser. But I think ultimately all roads lead back to the self. And if we can get to that point where we can kind of get out of our heads and into our hearts, we'll see that we have the answers we're looking for within in almost every case.
Yeah. And I think we need to drill down a little bit deeper on the how to do this, because, finding the happiness within ourselves is everybody's come across there. But let me backpedal, because we are both parents as well. So we have been children growing up, finding maybe the rat race and trying to see there must be something more or something different. And somehow we also observe our children from, and this is now parent to parent, and bear with me on this one, is I look at kids and they're so content. The first few years, nothing, as far as they're concerned, is wrong with them. They play with themselves, they play with their things, they play with themselves, thinking it's okay. They just do act and they're always happy. I mean, they're not happy if they're hungry or they need to be changed, fine. But in themselves, they seem to be having this fulfillment, which somehow then shifts to looking for this fulfillment through objects rather than through the subject who we are.
Yes, and I think part of that it becomes, we get on this the treadmill that society puts us on, where I've got to go to school, high school, then to college. I've got to get a good job, and then when I get a job, I have to pursue this thing and that thing. So they're kind of in this I think a child's in that pre-treadmill phase, but it's hard not to follow where society is directing you. That's for sure. And what weighs into that as well is just the egos. We kind of ignore the soul, our inner self, our true self, and we start listening to the ego, which is kind of the voice in our head that is telling us to pursue these things that in many cases give us short-term happiness, but not long-term happiness.
And I think this is exactly the point where socialization, as good as it is, because if you want to be part of a society, you have to, fold into it, follow rules, which often might be against what we are internally, i.e., the inner voices that we have. No, being humans, and then we get regulated, and then we start the woods and the shoulds and the hows we need to do this, and this is how we get into the red race. And I'm sure you saw it a little bit with your daughter. I'm seeing it with my daughter, despite trying to install and keep that original spirituality. I think that we all have within
Right.
our children.
Well, the pull of society is tough, and friends as well. You see your friends uh, pursuing this path, and you think, okay, that's the path for me as well. I think at a certain point, as parents, we have so much, a certain amount of influence on our children. We might have the greatest influence, but then their friends are kind of going in that direction. Society takes them in that direction. The media they consume takes them in that direction. It's hard to fight. But let me backtrack there just for a sec, just to say, you go back to our original conversation about being a regular guy. Now, I didn't, when I went in this spiritual path, I didn't say to myself, okay, I'm feeling more spiritual now. Let me drop out of society. Let me go to India and join an ashram, or let me go to Kentucky like Merton and become a monk in the hills of Kentucky. I still wanted to be a part of society. Why? Because at a certain point, I do like certain material things. I mean, we all want to live in a nice house. We all want to, I mean, personally, I like to go on vacations. We all want food in the refrigerator, the ability to go out and dine sometimes. So all that is good and well. But at a certain point, you have to get a balance. And I think for a lot of people, that balance is a little bit out of whack. They're too much moving toward that career pursuit and not ignoring what their inner self, what their soul may be telling them. But there can be a balance where these things are kind of equal. And I will say, career-wise, I mean, I've worked in advertising. You mentioned, New York City for about half my career. It is a rat race. I mean, positively. But at a certain point, as you're on the treadmill gets kind of more pitched, and you're going up this treadmill, and it becomes a little more difficult to go up. And the question becomes, at a certain point, do you want to get off the treadmill? Or if not get off it, just lower that pitch a little bit and say, you know what? I'm good where I'm at. I mean, I think a lot of us in our business careers, we just pursue the next higher up job. We want the next promotion, the next salary increase. And I personally, and I was in my early 40s when this happened, I said, you know what? I'm kind of in a middle management level now. I see what the stress level is of the people above me, the hours they're putting in, granted for more money, but I thought it's not worth it. It's just not worth it. So I personally, I said, you know what? I'm at the middle management level. I'm going to stay here. I won't be bucking for a promotion. I won't be asking for one. I won't be doing the extra credit of nights and weekends that might make it necessary. I'll do my job, be satisfied, and that way I can achieve this work-life balance.
I love that. I love that because I think there is this big question, what is spirituality? So we need to kind of define it. I think a lot of people have this woo-woo impression of what spirituality is, as you were just saying, okay, I'm spiritual. I must remove myself from our Western society and go somewhere, and join an ashram. Whereas the other minds say, hey, whatever we do, we can do it with awareness, with attention, and hence it is spiritual because you do it with the soul. And perhaps is this a little bit what you're trying to say is, hey, yeah, you can do a job. Maybe you don't want to have more, but you want to have it different, as in
Right.
how you approach it. And there is more to it, different.
Yes. Yeah. Spirituality, I mean, I would define, I'm glad you mentioned that, as connecting with something greater than yourself. And that can happen a number of ways. The old traditional way would be you'd go to church on Sunday, attend religious services, and that became your connection. But for a lot of people, they just weren't be included. And I was raised in the Catholic Church. I just wasn't finding satisfaction in that. I wasn't getting the nutrition, the spiritual nutrition that I felt like I needed. So I think what one needs to do, and I'm going to jump to another story right now. Napoleon Hill is a guy, and I read his book many years ago. He had this famous book called Think and Grow Rich. If you look at the Amazon bestseller list, it's I checked it a couple weeks ago. It's still the number one
Still the
self-help
number
book.
one we all learn.
Crazy,
Yeah,
crazy.
crazy.
So if you read that book, Think and Grow Rich, it's all about getting ahead, putting your nose to the grindstone, working as hard as you can to get ahead. And this book today is still the number one best-selling book, and it's an uber capitalist book. It's all about getting ahead in business. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that 40 years after that book came out, Napoleon Hill writes a sequel. He's 80 years old now, and he writes this book, and I urge people to check it out. Think and Grow Rich with Peace of Mind. And he had changed his tune altogether. Now, a lot of people didn't realize that he had thought about his philosophy and readjusted it. And I actually keep this quote on my desk. I have it right here. There's no real success unless one is successful at being happy.
Mm.
And that's where he ends up netting out. And he says, you know what? Nobody should work more than 8 hours a day, ideally less than 8 hours a day. And one should spend at least 8 hours a day toward worldly pursuits, whether it's reading spirituality, something outside of work. But I've always found it fascinating that people still pursue this think and grow rich mindset that he first espoused when he kind of corrected himself 40 years later. And I checked where that was in the bestseller list, and it was number 7,000 in the self-help group. So I think we have to kind of, I mean, I think it's a good idea to sort of adjust our thinking on what's really important when it comes to work and this work spiritual balance.
No, I agree. And I think if I just, out of my guts, if you ask me, okay, so why do you think one is still number one, the other one is number 7,000,
Right.
you just said, never got anywhere, is because Napoleon Hill very much also shaped how we think in our Western society, how we get on in careers and, just suck it up kind of mentality, which sometimes in the newer generation is not necessarily the case anymore. And that everything that has to do maybe with the soul or do it in a spiritual way, in a more balanced way, is not as efficient, productive, capitalist thinking, and very complex for the individual. Just within you. Okay, so I have to do all of this, but now I have to do it in a spiritual way. How? It adds maybe on one hand he wants to add relaxation and dimension to it, inner dimension, but on the other hand made it also so much more complex to just, hey, work hard,
Right.
strive for the biggest, and you'll be successful. I mean, that's easy, kind of.
Yes.
Right?
Uh, yeah. Just going back to, I mean, I think the previous question was around spirituality and this idea of connecting to something greater than yourself. Um, I began to find that I could then do that on my own. I mean, Can you do this without the help of another? Yes, you can. I mean, I think previous to our conversation, one of the best ways is meditation. But the key is if you consider yourself a person, and a lot of people call themselves, it's called SBNR, spiritual but not religious these days.
Mhm.
And I think those are just words unless you have some sort of practice that's helping you connect to something greater than yourself. We talked about meditation uh, just before we started recording this call and the importance of how meditation can help. But the key is if you are in this working environment, if you find yourself a little bit less than satisfied, what you've got to do is start engaging in somewhat of a spiritual practice, and it can be really simple. I mean, the key I tell people is really you've got to find 15 minutes a day for starters to be by yourself. You've got to get up if you have to do it in the morning, which I've always preferred, get up early in the morning with a cup of coffee before everyone else is up in the house. Maybe you have to do it later at night, but find these 15 minutes of alone time without your phone. Your phone's not going to be there. You're going to be by yourself and just focus on the center of yourself. Learn to breathe, learn a simple meditation technique, or just engage in, there's a thing called a gratitude practice where you can sit there by yourself and just rest, relax, and give thanks to the universe and just think of, here are the things I am thankful for. Here are the things that are good in my life. But I think a spiritual practice can start that simply. It can grow from there as you want it to. And honestly, my own spiritual practice can be very small some days. Other days it can be much bigger, depending on how much time I have. But you've got to start somewhere.
And I think this is so important, this downtime, this 15 minutes just for yourself. And a lot of people, they actually don't realize this is the beginning of your own spiritual just silence, maybe listening to nothing, and all of a sudden something comes up. They might think it's laziness. It's something you shouldn't be doing. You should be right up there and just perform, perform, perform. And I think this is what I love about your book is that you kind of unplug this. You don't have to be always full on. Actually, being full on is being fully just full on with you and do that right in the moment. And that is already what you were saying, the path, the connection to our higher self. Talk us through this, how it happened to you, where you actually felt, oh, I'm actually connecting to my higher self. And how did you experience that?
I think the spiritual path is just that. You're not reaching a destination. It's about the journey. But along that journey, you have certain mileposts where you kind of realize that maybe there is something greater out there. I mean, I've had some my own unique spiritual experiences that I talk about in the book, but the more basic ones, and I can tell you one. There was a point. A great way to connect with spirituality is through
Mm,
nature.
mm,
Can be one way. And when I talked about meditation, there's two types of meditation. I mean, the one is they call it an emptying meditation, where that's a traditional meditation where maybe you have a mantra, you're emptying yourself, you're clearing your mind. But then there's another type of meditation that is not talked about quite as much, and it's a filling meditation. And that can be you are sitting on the beach looking at the ocean. You're just filled with something in nature. You can be walking out in the woods. And I can tell you one of the first moments that it really struck me. I was living in Houston, Texas at the time. And I was living, if people know Houston, inside the loop. So it's a pretty traffic-filled area, lots of bars, restaurants, fun place to be. And I lived in a brownstone, and behind the brownstone was just a paved driveway with a garage in the back, and just concrete everywhere. But against the fence, there was a little cutout, and there was a cutout maybe 2 feet by 2 feet where there was a plant there, just a basic green, bushy kind of plant. And I was sitting outside one day. It had been chilly. It was a warm day. I was sitting out in the sun, just, you know, semi-meditating, but just relaxing, taking my 15 minutes. there was no breeze in the air, but I began to look at this plant. And the plant itself, it almost seemed like the leaves were kind of waving in an imaginary breeze. And again, this spiritual connection can happen in odd ways. Here was this little plant bush thing in the middle of a concrete jungle. And somehow I connected with that and thought, wow, there's something more going on here. I'm making some kind of connection with nature. And what happens at those points is it's this overwhelming sense that all is good in the world. Everything is right. I don't have any concerns or problems. Again, it goes back to I'm feeling this connection to something greater than myself. That's one example, but it can really, I think, happen any any number of ways. And we talked about that. I can sometimes feel that connection just reading a good spirituality book. A guy I read a lot about is Richard Rohr, and his one of the things he says is that when we connect with this deeper part of ourselves, with our inner true self, he said that is the place that also intersects with God. And God is kind of a loaded word. I often just use the G word, but when you can get to that point, that sense of contentment, of happiness, has the ability, even in a 15-minute section, to carry throughout the day. And I find, and I think most people will find, that when you have this inner contentment inside, it also affects how you interact with everyone else. You seem to address, look at everyone else with greater kindness and greater compassion. So I do think this spirituality work is really, it helps you in the interior, but it also helps how you interact with everyone else around you.
Yes, and you write this also in your book, and we're going to go into the nitty-gritty of your book in a moment. And what you were just saying was just triggering this vision in me. I think this moment of this tranquility where you have that connection to the greater or to the greater self, or the G word, as you say, is what you tend to find in meditation. And it's like dropping a stone into the water, and that is actually your meditation. And then these ripple effects really are what you carry through in how you respond to your outer world. You become a lot more stoic. It's just not something you are so full, you're vibrating, and this vibration you carry on. And if somebody is just not the way you expect them to be, instead of reacting, you can kind of go like, yeah, all right, I can take this. And that may change the entire dynamic of that conversation, potential fight,
Right.
of that whatever dynamics in society. And it can start with you, your wife, can start in the family, friends, and work, and then greater society, which I think is absolutely fabulous.
Right, right. And we talked about meditation. And again, meditation can be scary for some people. It was for me for many years, but it's as simple as getting out of your head. It can be focusing on the breath in and out, having a very simple mantra that you repeat over and over. When you do that, it kind of gets you out of your head, puts you in a different place. But when you can achieve that, and you know this, when you can achieve that calmness and meditation frequently throughout the day, you can reflect back on that moment and boom, it sets back in. It has a way of not just helping you in that moment of meditation, but throughout the day.
No, absolutely. And I'm studying neuro-linguistic programming, and there, Richard Bandler, he is kind of like the creator of NLP, teaches you anchoring, where you kind of get into a state and you can anchor with a certain movement or pressing a part of your body, that sensation whenever you find yourself in need of getting back into that state. And it can be that state you reach perhaps during meditation or during that moment connecting with nature. You press that part of your body, you can get straight away into it through a physical impulse trigger, and which is fascinating, compounding on just keeping it, a cognitive practice, let's say a spiritual
Right.
practice, you make it physical, which I thought is also really cool. Um, on the point of what you said, spiritual but not religious. Now I hear that also more and more, Tom. What do you make of this? Is this and you know, there's no judgment. I'm spiritual, I'm not religious, I'm not even baptized, and I do not judge religious people or not. But I've heard more and more people exactly what you said. I don't find what I'm going to church for. I don't know what they're going to church for. But what are your experiences? What is your reading? What are your mentors telling about this perhaps phenomenon?
Well, religion, and I'll go back to a quote from Richard Rohr. Religion is not the moon itself, it's pointing at the moon. And the idea there is that church and whoever you're dealing with at church, be it a priest, a rabbi, an imam, they become the connection to God, the middleman. And what you have to then question is, do I need that middleman to connect with God? Um, I can recall I was in a church wedding just a few months ago, and they had a communion service, and it was a Catholic church. And if you didn't want to get the host and go to communion, you could go up and get a blessing from the priest. And a friend of mine said, "Hey, aren't you going to go up and get the blessing?" And I said, "No, I don't need the middleman. I can do that directly." So I think that's what religion is helps some people. And I do think, I mean, it does some bad things in the world, but it does help a lot of people. And if it helps you, fantastic. I know for a lot of us, it does not. But again, going back to that phrase, spiritual but not religious, I mean, some people might toss that out to say, well, I kind of believe in a greater power that you may or may not call God. Um, but that's about as far as it goes. And I do think that that will come up ultimately empty for you. If you're not trying to engage that spiritual side of yourself, you're not probably not, I can't say it's the same for everyone, find that kind of contentment or that connection to something greater that you may not even know you're looking for. I mean, there's a guy by the name of Jacob Needleman, and he writes about it's a great word, the yearning, the spiritual yearning. And a lot of us will have that yearning, but not know what it means. And they'll try to satisfy that yearning with different things. You might even turn to, alcohol or drugs to try to satisfy that yearning or that hole at your center. And I think the best way for most people to satisfy that yearning is through engaging with their spiritual side, their spiritual nature in some way.
And I think with regards to that yearning, I find this very interesting. I wonder whether most people turn to these, well, maybe sometimes also drugs or unconducive behavior because they actually don't know what this yearning is. And I heard it, for example, in Kabbalah, they say Kabbalah can't come to you. You have to go to it. Yeah, you have to be open. Like you cannot give unsolicited advice. It will fall on deaf ears. You know, you can give advice that might be picked up when somebody's asking and the same thing. Only if you have that yearning, you have that motivation to go out, perhaps to search, you may find. Maybe you go through, I don't know, a chain of abusive behavior before you arrive then at a spiritual level or at the basic things like nature.
Yeah, yeah. To talk about that yearning that you may or may not be able to fill. Yeah, when you talk about alcohol and drugs, yes, that is a way just to kind of it doesn't satisfy that yearning. It just numbs that yearning, which of course will just come back again the next day. Um, but for me, I think if you don't have that yearning, and I suppose there are some people that, go through life without it, that's fantastic. But if you do sense that there's something maybe missing in your life, then you really should do something about it. Um, we talked about the career a little bit, and I have friends, and I can think of one friend in particular who's at retirement age and had a very successful career, and now he's retired, living in Florida, and he's filling his time with golf, and he's not really finding that that satisfaction. Now he did just pick up my book, thankfully, and he promises me he's going to start reading it. But I do think you have to find something to address that need that I think is inherent within all of us. You mentioned going out to find it. The other thing that you'll read a lot is this in most famous Indian guru, Yogananda. I mean, his big thing was, hey, you have to realize the presence within you. So that's the other thing is if you can find that quiet time, it's kind of there. The presence is already there, waiting to be recognized. And again, I think it's something that most of us can do with just a little effort.
And you talk about it in your book. You call it the inner voice, and you refer to it in one of your interviews. I researched, like, the annoying flatmate. So,
Right.
that kind of speaks to you. Talk to us a little bit about this, because it is all very good to go into silence, but how do you really distinguish your voice from outside noise? And how do you really find that, let's say, the purpose you also talk about in your book, and the trajectory to find it? How do you do it?
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned yeah, flatmate. I think I use the term roommate, but it's Sam Harris. He talks about this idea that he says, a lot of times like you'll walk into your house and you have this voice chirping in your ear. It's talking to you all the time. It's criticizing you. It's saying, "Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that?" It's like an annoying roommate that follows you from room to room. And you would never put up with a roommate like that, who just followed you everywhere and was constantly chirping at you, often criticizing you. So that is really the first step when we talk about meditation. That's really the goal. You want to quiet that annoying voice that's in your head. You have to shush it, kind of. And meditation becomes one way to do that. You really have to get out of the head and into the heart, and there are ways to do that. Um, really to find what you're looking for. In that voice, I mean, even the most spiritual among us will hear that voice all the time. We probably get better at keeping it quiet, but it pops up now and then, and honestly, it doesn't do us a lot of good most of the time. I mean, sometimes it may be giving us a warning that we should heed, but often it's not helping us at all.
Yeah,
And
and
if we,
sorry,
right,
go ahead.
yeah, if we can quiet it and look within, we're much better off.
Yeah, but interesting is that in your book you actually say, well, let it pass. Just say, acknowledge it, and then just say, okay, fine, you're there, you can talk. I go
Right.
on with what I want to do anyway, because the more you seem to fight it, the more they shout back at you, these voices, these annoying roommates. Flatmate is very British. So
Yes.
that's
Yes. Yeah. I think it was Pima Chodron who referred to it as if you can, and you really do have to kind of step back from yourself a little bit, and sometimes you have to let the voice go. But she compared it to those thoughts as that voice as clouds passing in the sky, and just get that cloud to pass, and then you try to be free of it.
Yes, and you have a fabulous quote in your book, and it goes along the line, always remember, you are the sky, everything around you is just the weather.
Yes,
Love
correct.
it.
I think that was the quote I just botched, but
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
you
yeah,
said
yeah,
it
yeah. Okay.
exactly right. That's
All
it.
right.
Yes,
Okay. No, I love that
perfect.
one. Okay, well, let's start a little bit about really these 16 weeks worth of reading of the Wake Up Call. I love the way your editor, you said, wanted to structure this book, which makes it extremely usable in terms of like a manual. You really take it every day for 16 weeks if you want to. And you start with these 7 categories, which in each week are basically the 7 days you should look at these aspects. Can you talk us a little bit through how you structured it, these 7 categories, and why they are so fundamental in creating a better you, a better life, a better atmosphere around you?
I think in the intro I might mention this that I take a 360 degree of look at spirituality. And what I realize is it's more than spirituality alone to be, the best possible version of yourself. So I do have sections that deal with things that are quasi-spiritual. I talk about just general inspirations, things that get you, thinking, better thoughts about you and the world around you. But also, I delve into one of the weeks or one of the days of the week is about character. And I think that's very important. I mean, we all know people that go to church on Sunday and right after the service, they are, bad-mouthing their neighbor or their friends. But really, you want to develop your character as well. So I do delve into that area um, quite a bit. And really, it comes down to how can I be a better person? So I do talk to um, issues of just how to be kinder, how to be more compassionate, um, how to realize that everyone around you is potentially going through a struggle, and how you should really, show sympathy to those around you. I mean, if you are great inside and you're not exhibiting that outside to those around you, then your spirituality is kind of false. It's not complete. So that's why I began veering off into these, other areas as well.
Yeah, what I very much liked was, as you were saying, how can you pass on, is the concept of kindness, just the mere acknowledgement. And I think there was another quote I remember is where you said, well, one of the biggest gifts you can give somebody is your undivided attention.
Positively. It's the difference between, and I have to credit my wife for giving me this one. But she caught me one time and she said, "You're not listening, you're just waiting to speak." And I thought, wow, I wrote that down right away. And I thought, well, that is great because that's what a lot of us do in conversation. We're not really listening or attentive to the other person and what they're saying. We're waiting to get our 2 cents in. So I think that's vital. Um, there's another story in the book where it's off an old businessman by the name of John Templeton, and he had this theory. I shortened it to recognize, encourage, praise. And recognize means as you go out into the world, it could be in your own home. I mean, greet people with a good morning, a wave, a smile. If you see someone that feels like they might need a little boost, encourage them. If you see the garbage man out there, say, give them thanks for, doing a great job. And then praise people. If you see someone it can be anything from they're well dressed or they did a good job on something, praise them. It's all about um, giving to others. And again, going back to Templeton, he had this idea that when you give to others, you get in return. It's just like a universal law. The more we give, the more we get. It's just how nature seems to work. And yeah, so it's something to remember with each interaction, with each person you encounter, right down to, I mean, the person at the bank, at the grocery checkout line, wherever you may be, they could probably use a little boost, and it can be simple as asking them how their day is going and giving them a few words of encouragement.
No, absolutely. And for anybody who doesn't believe it, I think it's a question of just trying. If you want the world to smile at you, just smile first. And it works 1,000 times out of 1,000 times.
Yes,
If you're the first one to smile, then you'll get it back. I mean, people might be looking at you dazzled, but they will smile back. It's actually quite impressive. And I remember my first ever boss at Lehman Brothers. Back then, Lehman Brothers did exist, investment bank.
right?
And his name was Siegfried. I'm not going to tell the last name. And he said, always remember one thing: say hello to Madame Pipi. Now, that's very European to say that. What it means is always greet the person looking after the lavatories, right? Acknowledge,
Gotcha.
say good morning. Of course, you could just say, if it had been left like this, it's an act of kindness. But of course, then the last part of his sentence was, because one day she might become your boss. which is also true, mind you, Tom, right? But I
Right.
think there is a truth in both parts of that sentence. But I think there's absolute recognition. It's not about hearing you, it's about listening, taking in, maybe asking a couple of questions, this active listening. And I'm so happy, Tom, you mentioned your wife, because you've been married for over 25 years, if I may, share that also with our audience.
Yes.
And that is a long time in a time where we had a huge transition, not only in society, but mostly driven also by technology and how society interacts with each other. So, I wonder whether spirituality, and also Thomas More, one of your guides, as far as
Right.
I understand, he wrote, I think, Spirituality and Sex, or The Soul of Sex, or something.
Yes.
I wonder what is the would you say one of those main ingredients which you would label with spirituality that carries a long-term loving relationship?
Well, we've touched on them. I mean, that same idea that we just talked about, that you're going to engage with people outside you. I mean, the first person you should be engaging with is your spouse. And I mean, that starts, and I'm an early riser. I'm up first in the morning, but that starts with, greeting that person with a kiss and a good morning and a hug. I mean, that person you spend more time with, ideally, than anyone else in your life. So you have to make sure you should make sure that relationship is solid. And that starts with just some of these basic ideas that we just talked about. I mean, with our spouse, we have a better sense if something isn't right or is something off. And that's when it's time to sit down and discuss it, talk about it a little bit. I will say something else, though. I mean, we talk about that hole that needs to perhaps be filled. And I mean, I married, I was past 30. I think I was actually 34 years old when I married. But before that time, I was dating quite a bit. And I was jumping jobs. I was jumping around to different girlfriends as well. And
Yeah.
again, I can tell you right now, it was to try to fill that hole that romance or sexual pursuits was not going to fill. And I think when you get to spirituality, if you try to fill that hole with spirituality, you say, aha, that's what was missing. And when we hear about spouses having a midlife crisis, I wonder if it isn't something else that's missing in their life, that they decide to, pursue something romantically when maybe the answer is really a little closer to home.
Meaning looking at themselves rather than looking at something outside of
Yes, yes, not that thing out there will make me happy, but let me look inside to see what's really off and not quite right.
No, I get that. I think that is so, so true, because we are very quick in pointing fingers. I'm not happy because you're not making me happy, dear husband, dear wife, or what have you.
Right. Good
But
point.
yeah, not necessarily so. Another one I wanted to pick up on, you talk about engaging with people, and you have a fantastic part in week 3 about Bill Murray, how, that
Yes.
comedian actor, how he just does outrageous things, but are they so
Yes.
outrageous in society? Tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, sure. I've been a fan of Murray, and then over the years, I ran across a couple of stories on him, and they were about the fact that he likes to go when he's out and about. He likes to engage with others, and he actually uses the words "wake them up." He says he sees too many people walking around in a sleep, and he wants to give them a wake-up call. So he does that quite a bit. He will drop into by surprise. He will come across a wedding in the park and suddenly join the festivities. There's a story of how he was taking a cab one day, talking to the cab driver, and the cab driver was a sax player who had the sax in his trunk, couldn't find the time to play. So Bill Murray said, "I'll tell you what, this is on me. Let me drive your cab. You're going to sit in the back seat and play the sax for me." And he did that. So he is always trying to kind of shake things up a little bit. It sort of goes back to that idea of, I mean, when I named the book and my blog Wake Up Call, a wake up call when I thought about it, is something we used to get in hotels all the time. If you're traveling or on business, we don't do it that much anymore because we have cell phones with alarms on them. But the wake up call would always come when you didn't really want it to come. It would usually be early in the morning. The phone would be loud. It would jolt you out of your sleep, and you'd go reaching for the phone to get that thing to stop. But I think that's a good metaphor for life. Sometimes we need those wake up calls, those moments where we say, you know what? I am not really engaged with life. I'm just sleepwalking through life. I need to wake up and be a little bit more alert and aware. And it's something Bill Murray tries to do when he's out in the world. I mean, he can get away with it because he's Bill Murray, but he's got a long list of uh, eh, situations where he just puts himself in the middle of situations he probably shouldn't be in, but he people walk away smiling and laughing and say, "Can you believe that happened?"
Yeah, no, I love that because I think what you were saying about we're sleepwalking through life. And that is really just the rat race. Rat race sounds so active, so engaged, but it's not. It is, if you think about so many people that just do exactly the same at exactly the same time every single day. And as we are, habit-driven creatures, it goes into automation. So you actually
Yes,
don't have to think about, and that is what makes us numb. I mean, it's a really good thing by nature to automate as much as we can so we are free for something else, but that something else is not engaged often.
right,
And right. And this wake-up call, I think, is wonderful because it actually, even though it's painful, but you're feeling something. Oh my God, there's an emotion,
right.
right?
Yeah, you become more in the moment. I mean, that's an issue a lot of us have. We're constantly thinking about the past, we're thinking about the future, what we're going to do next, but we're not there in the moment. And there's this old, I think it's Buddhist idea of when you wash the dishes, be involved with what you're doing. And I've thought about that even in business, where people sometimes say, I get my best ideas in the shower. That hasn't, I don't know if that's ever really happened to me, but it's like, when you're in the shower, take in the
Be in the
shower.
shower.
Yes, be in the shower.
Yeah, I agree, but I think this is kind of that's actually really quite how the brain works. That when it disengages, it actually engages, and then all of a sudden it pops up these ideas or memories or whatever
Right,
you asked it a long time ago. I think there's a couple of different systems, but I think this is exactly the spiritual thing to be in the moment. Eckhart Tolle is a very good, author talking about this. You've got always
right.
just answer. The first thing he says is, if you wake up and you think about yesterday, you're already in your yesterday. You miss the now
Yes.
to create the tomorrow. So please
Power of
wake up.
now.
Exactly, the power of
Yes.
now. And I'm also an early bird, and my listeners might have heard it before. But the first, I get up in the morning. For me, mornings are magic. And the first thing I do, straight out of bed, I go into the bathroom. I have a freezing shower. I mean, literally, I have got like my night on me, and I wash it up with a freezing shower, and I'm whoa. And it is so beautifully painful. By now, I've been doing it for the last 4 years. By now, I cannot have warm showers anymore. It literally hurts your skin. It's amazing. But that also vibrates through the day. But that's my first feel because it's
Wow.
but like whoa. And that is, and you really feel your body, you see it turning red, you see it pumping. And then if you have an aura ring, it shows you that your heart rate went all of a sudden into the stratosphere. But you need that. You need that.
Wow, that's amazing. My nephew is a big proponent and he does ice baths all the time.
That's
And
that's really hardcore. The Iceman.
oh, and
No,
he's trying to talk to me. He said, "You should try it. You would really get something out of it." But I guess it's the same effect with that cold shower in the morning.
no,
Ooh,
no,
that
no,
would be
no,
rough,
no.
but
Yeah, it's rough. It's rough. It's amazing. My husband goes like, oh my God. All right. And another one. Okay, then, because I'm such a biohacker. Another crazy idea she does. But for me, it works.
right.
And I think anything in this very, structured world and overstimulating world, on one hand, we are overstimulated. On the other hand, we don't feel ourselves because of that overstimulation. It's like rubbing. After a while, you just don't feel anything, and then you feel
Right.
pain, and then everything is over, right? But coming back to your book, there's one thing you mentioned this character. You said there are 11 traits of character I think it's in week 7.
Right.
What are the main characters you'd say to our audience are really fundamental to really show to yourself you're a person of character? You're not a sheep, you're not a zombie, you're not, an avatar, but you're building your character day after day and are actually congruent and consistent.
Well, we talked about some of them. I mean, the ideas of being kind and compassionate. And another one is humility, is realizing that the world does not revolve around you, that you're just a small, you know, cog in the wheel. And really, I believe, I mean, you can be totally confident in yourself and your abilities, but still be humble. And I think that's another important characteristic, that you try not to make it about you, but try to make it about those around you. I think the character chapter comes from yeah, it's from David Brooks. And Brooks talks about this idea that there are these two mountains in life. And the first mountain is all about um, our career path, and it's about fame and prestige and climbing the ladder, and it really is about the ego. But at a certain point, ideally, we begin to come off of that. And I think part of the business world, and I know you've seen it, is that you do encounter people who are so hard driving that they don't care about you as a person. But ideally, at a certain point in your life, you begin to realize you come down that first mountain and you get on the second mountain. And the second mountain is more about not what you're going to do for yourself, but what you're going to do for others, for those around you. And I think that's so important in the realm of character, that you take the emphasis off of you and your needs and begin to look at what can help and assist those around you. Now, of course, to reach that stage, you have to be secure in yourself. You have to have a level of confidence. But I think when you reach that place, ideally, you make that turn where it's not so much about you, it becomes more about the other person.
And in the corporate world, I think this is very easy to translate. I think if you are somebody that wants a career and you make constantly decisions that are, that you're pushing your concept because of you rather than because it's good for the overall business, that's very short-term thinking. And a corporation is nothing else than people, a bunch of people working together for the greater good. And the greater good is the prosperity, the longevity of the business, which will then be able to carry through all of those employees with employment and hence with compensation. So I think the ego drive, keeping it balanced with, okay, I would like to do this, but actually long term it's better for the corporation to make a different kind of decision, is fundamental. And I think it's easily translated to it. Whether it's easy to implement is a different question. Well, let me just then go to a couple more points before I let you off, Tom. The one is the monk's life hacks. Which ones
Right.
are, yeah, I love those. Which ones are your favorite ones? I mean, monks, you always think they don't have life hacks. They just, they're
Yeah.
so
Well,
content, they meditate all day. But life hacks, I like that.
yeah. Well, I'm thinking back to that story. It's actually, some of those life hacks are from a guy. He's called the Urban Monk. So he lives in a city. I believe he's in L.A. And a couple of things I can recall him saying, and one I engage in on a regular basis, is um, naps. The Bennett that was one of the hacks, and I found over the past few years, and I began to do this when I was working on a full-time basis is sneaking in a quick shut eye, what I call a cat nap or a mini nap, just to recharge and revitalize the batteries. So I have found that if I can, carve out a half hour of my day or 20 minutes of my day just to shut my eyes for a few minutes, I will briefly fall into a sleep and then wake up recharged and refreshed. So I think there's some benefit to naps. I'm a big proponent.
Obvious,
As I,
yeah.
as I recall, another point was um, when you're on vacation, be on vacation. And that is something that I didn't do for the early part of my career. I was always plugged in. If I'm away, I'm checking and a lot of us do it, checking my email, checking messages, phoning into a meeting here and there. But the point is, and I guess this aligns with the nap idea as well, sometimes we just have to disconnect a little bit. And whether that's over a week-long vacation or a half hour break from the day, I think it's vitally important. Um, I can recall when I was in New York City, um, working for an ad agency, and it was pretty high stress. I worked on 42nd Street, and around the corner on 44th Street was a church. So what I would do if things got especially tense is I would get up from my desk. I would go down the elevator, walk out the building around the corner to a church on 44th Street because it was nice and quiet. And I would enter the church, sit in the very back row, and just take in the stained glass, look around, and just sit there quietly and recharge my batteries, head back to the office feeling like a new person. So I do think we need those times to disengage, and sometimes, we need to do it even during a busy day.
Absolutely. And I think to actually remove yourself physically, if you can do it, is really important. And just to sit there, and I can so imagine you doing this, sitting there on the pew, and just to be. I mean, you don't have to answer, you don't have to listen, you can just be. And within that, that kind of, I don't want to say blob, but within this kind of, oh,
Well, and that's it. And you mentioned it earlier. It's this idea of let me take myself out of what's going on right now, not thinking about the past, not thinking about the present. Let me just be. And sometimes that, people may say, oh, it's impossible. They call it the monkey mind, is always chatting. Well, you need a diversion. And sometimes that diversion can be as simple as focusing on your breath. Breathe in slowly, breathe out slowly, focus on the breath, and suddenly the attention is away from the mind, it's on the breath.
no, absolutely. And you do have breathing exercises also as part of your book. And the great reason why it works apart from the actual oxygenation is that the brain can only think one thought. So if you focus on one thought, everything else is quiet, right? But just
Yes,
to focus on that one thought is sometimes a bit of a struggle. Tom,
agreed.
you write at the book at the beginning of the book, at the intro, I said, I write is okay. So if you had to choose one person you'd go for coffee or a beer with, who in the world would that be? Who would it be for you?
Well, that's a good question, a tough question. I think it for me it would be he's now in his 80s. You mentioned Thomas More earlier. Thomas More, I mean, just opened up my eyes to the whole world of the soul. He's written a number of books. You mentioned The Soul and Sex. He's done The Soul and Work. He started with Care of The Soul and Religion. But he has these books that are about the inner workings of the soul. And he speaks with just such authority about the soul and how to address the needs of the soul that I just gobble up that stuff. And just to think about that a little bit, the nature of the soul, so people have an idea. I always think of if you think of ourselves as a house, our spirit is kind of up high. It's that brightly lit attic. We live on the main floor of the house. The soul is kind of the basement. The soul is deep within. And when we go down to that basement, we see it's really deep. There are tunnels and alleyways that go forever. And really, that's where our innermost desires come from, thoughts, direction. The soul doesn't care what's happening in society, doesn't care what society wants from us. The soul's looking for something deeper. It's looking for this deeper satisfaction. And I do believe if you believe in reincarnation and if you've lived past, you believe that you may have lived past lives, well, that's all in the soul. That's all down there. That's who makes you, you know, as well as your heritage, your upbringing. I mean, that makes you who you are. So
And
yeah, M Moore is a fascinating character. I highly recommend virtually any of his books, but I find with his books that what I like to do is read a book and underline what I think are the good parts, and I go through a Moore book, and half the book is underlined.
oh, you should see my books. It's like, I can. The good thing is about reading books like this, like working through them, nobody wants to have them borrowed. So I can keep all my books. Nobody wants my books because, of course, I taint them. But I ordered 3 of his books today, inspired by you, by the way. So Amazon definitely had a customer more today. But talking about the soul, and I'm happy you talked about, or you mentioned Thomas More, and I got the feeling from your writings and the research I did on you that he was one of the most influential characters, and still is, in your life. Soul searching. Now, how do we go about soul searching? How do we know, oh, this is me, myself, and I, my soul? And how do we know that how do we know when a soul is sad?
Hmm. Yeah, I think, you know, one of the things Moore writes about is the soul actually does get sad and melancholy sometimes. And when those moments occur, I mean, Moore is big on you have to ride those moments out. Do not follow the lead of society unless you have serious issues of you know going to pharmaceuticals. Sometimes the soul does get sad. But that soul, to me, it's sort of attached to the deep within us as well. If we can listen to it, it's tied to our intuition and the direction we should go in is tied directly to that intuition. Um, Ralph Waldo Emerson, an American philosopher, he had this idea that everything could be found with the soul, and you could access the soul through what he called it lowly listening. And it is kind of what it sounds like. You have to find those moments of solitude, of quiet, to really reflect deep within, not just on a surface level, get out of the head, go deep within. And often our intuition of what we should do is, I think, directly tied to the yearnings of the soul. Um, it can be tricky because sometimes these ideas come through our head, but if you start engaging in a regular meditation practice, if you start engaging, I mean, one of Moore's ways to engage with the soul he talks about is going to an art museum. Walk around an art museum and really start taking in the pictures. Stop at each picture and really start to take it in. It's a way to engage with the soul. It's something deep within us that we can't almost always put our finger in. We know when the soul's engaged, we know when it's there. And really, I think the best way to tap into that, to access that, is to listen to that voice of intuition within us. And there are some people that say that intuition, when you can tap into that true self, that becomes then really the voice of God giving you direction in life.
And that is what happened to you in 1993. Because one thing, Tom, I think at least, one thing, Tom, is to actually find that voice, which is already great. The other thing is to follow it, because that is A, implementation, and B, has consequences. You do not follow your soul, the voice, your intuition in a vacuum.
I mean, somebody has said to me, well, what if the soul wants to do something absolutely crazy? And I said, well, all right, your intellect can act as a check. If it seems like totally insane, then okay, well, then maybe that's probably not your soul talking. But I have found that at those moments when especially when things are a little off kilter, if you can find that alone time, and you mentioned the morning, and that's my time as well. Um, it's funny. if I can sit there, and I did it today, one of the first things I do, you do the cold shower, I will get the coffee maker going. I will stretch. And I have a whole stretching routine that takes 10 or 15 minutes. By then, the coffee's ready. I'll get a cup of coffee. Right now, it's a little chilly where I am. We have an electric fireplace that puts off fake flames, but it's kind of engaging to look at. So I will sit there, and if there's anything troubling me, if there any is anything that I need to figure out, somehow in that 15-minute session, the answer comes to me. Now, there are other ways to do that. I mean, I've read quite a bit that for some people it's a dream practice. A
Mhm.
lot of times, if we have ideas or thoughts in our head, answers will come to us in dreams. That happens to me infrequently, but it does happen, and it happens quite a bit to others. The key with that is any kind of dream practice, keep a pad and pen near your bed. As much as you think upon waking, I will remember this when I get up. It's frequently like sand in our fingers. It drifts out. So write those things down as they come to you. It's another way that the soul speaks to us.
Yeah, no, I so agree. And yes, I don't remember right now which book it was, but it is the soliciting your own dreams and engaging. And when you can ask before going to sleep your question, and it's a question of practice. And then apparently, well, the answers may come to you during the night, and you wake up with the answer and go like, okay, now I know what to do. Tom, well, listen, last question for today. Looking at your book on all these practices, 16 weeks worth of reading, if you choose to work through your book like this, what would you say are the three main suggestions on, starting a spiritual practice you want to point out to our viewers, to our community, they could kind of start with, or where they think, oh, can I be spiritual at all? And you say, yeah, if you do this, try it, you may sooner or later feel something. What would you say these three things
Well,
are?
I can look at it, the three points. One, if you are in the working world, if you find that you do have this yearning we talked about, this whole at your center, um, back off a little bit. Don't get caught up in the pursuit of your career, material goods, whatever. You need to back off a little bit. The other thing you're going to need to do is find a way to quiet that voice in your head we talked about it because that's the voice of the ego. So to do that, you're going to have to get in touch with your true self, the soul. You're going to have to quiet that voice in your head. So once you do those first couple of things, and you recognize you have to quiet the voice in your head, and talk to the voice in your soul, or listen to the voice in your soul, that's when the spiritual practice comes in. So if you can agree that maybe my work isn't doing everything for me, my career is not totally satisfying, I feel this yearning, well, then you're going to have to quiet that voice in your head a little bit. You're going to have to get in touch with the inner self. And we've touched on a few of these ways, but the very first thing you should start doing is find those 15 minutes we talked about.
Mm.
Find it in the morning, find it at night. If you're part of a busy family, you may have to get up. You may have to set the alarm, get up ahead of others. You may have to stay up later at night when everyone goes to sleep. But if you can find those 15 minutes as a starting place, learn to focus on the breath, learn a very basic meditation technique. And I will add here, I mean, there's lots of apps out there that are pretty good. There's a app by Sam Harris that I've like called Waking Up, a more basic one, I believe it's called Headspace. But if you need to use one of those apps, and then just that begins the process of getting in touch with this inner part of yourself. And from there, I mean, as you know, there's a number of ways in the book and other things you can do, but you have to start, I think, from that space. And from that space, I mean, things can blossom.
Okay, so take those 15 minutes, try to listen to yourself, try to kind of quieten the inner critic and just be, first of all, and just be in the moment with you. That is kind of a three-step beginner's guide You'd say?
Positively. And from there, there are a ton of ways you can enhance and grow your spiritual practice.
Well, Tom, I think with our undivided attention over the last hour and 15 minutes, we've been extremely spiritual apart from talking about it.
Well, I've really enjoyed the conversation.
So
Thank
did
you.
I. Thank you so much for having been with us. Tom Rapsas. Well, get this book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And you can read it from the front, from the back, through the week's wake-up call, daily insights for the spiritually curious. As you know, our tagline here on The Pulse is stay curious. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you next time again. And thanks again to Tom Rapsas. Bye.
Thank you.
Go out there together. We begin to share together. We find our way.